Okay, in this lesson, we're going to learn a little bit more about classes, constructors, and methods. So we're going to start by making a class for cats, and let's make some instance variables for our cats. So private, and we'll have a string for the name of the cat. Then private, and we'll have an int to capture the age of the cat, private, and then we'll get a Boolean to capture if the cat has been adopted or not. So remember, Boolean is a true-false variable. Okay, now let's make a constructor. So public, and then the name of the class, open bracket. And let's see, we'll have our constructor receive some information. So this information, when we put it in the constructor's signature here, these are called arguments. So the arguments that the constructor is going to receive would be a string for the cat's initial name. And you can call this variable whatever you want. So init for initial name, that's fine. If you want to be shorter, you could call it just an X. It's a temporary holding variable to pass information into the constructor. So I'm going to go ahead from habit and use initial name for this argument. Then we'll have an int that we're going to receive with the cat's initial age. And we're going to have a Boolean that's received with the cat's adoption status. So we could have adopted there, initial adopted. And those would be the arguments of this constructor. So now that we have arguments being passed in, the data that gets passed from the method or from the constructor's call is going to get temporarily stored in these argument variables, and we have to assign them to the instance variables for the class when we instantiate a new cat object. So we're going to go ahead and assign name to the initial name of the cat. Okay, then we'll assign age with the initial age, and we'll assign adopted with the value for the initial adopted that's passed in by parameter. Now, if we think about when we create a new cat object for this pet shelter, we would assume that a cat being dropped off to the pet shelter has not yet been adopted. So this is most likely going to start out as false. So we really don't need to include that. We could just assume that it's going to be false. And we don't even have to assign it a value in the constructor, because instance variables, if they're not assigned a value explicitly in the constructor, they're going to be assigned either 0 or null depending on their type. So primitive data like ints, doubles, chars, boolean is a primitive. That'll get assigned a 0 if it's not given another value in the constructor. Object types like string, that would be assigned null as its default value if it wasn't assigned a value in the constructor. Okay, so then we can close the brackets on that constructor. Okay, let's go over to our main. This is cat's main is the class, and that's where we've got our main method being housed. And let's go ahead and create a new cat object. So we start with the class name with capital letter, so cats. Then we'll call this one pet number 1. So pet 1 equals new cat, so new cats. And then we're going to pass to this constructor the values for what we know about this cat. So let's say this cat's name is Max, that's a string. Max is 3 years old, and we don't need to pass in his adoption status because remember in our constructor, we are receiving 2 parameters, the name and the age of the cat, and then its adoption status, it will be default to a false, okay? So let's go ahead and compile. And when I hit compile on the main, right, the runner, it's going to also compile my class that's in it because it's going to get here to this constructor and say, oh, I need to get to that class, the cat's class, and run that constructor. So now both of these have compiled. Okay, now if I want to access one of these instance variables, I'm going to need a method in order to get to it. So I'm going to create myself a method that's public so it can be accessed. And let's return the adoption status. So public, and then the return type of the data will be Boolean, and we'll call this method isAdopted. Okay, I'm not going to pass any information into the method. I'm trying to get information out of this method. So I'm going to have the method return to the call the adoption status, which is in the instance variable adopted. Okay. So I can call this method and it's going to return the Boolean that's stored as this instance variable. So now that I have a cat object created, I'm going to go ahead and call that method pet1.isAdopted, and that's what the method call looks like. Now that's going to return, because the return type on that method is Boolean, it's going to return true or false. So what do I want to happen with that? Right now it's got nothing when it's received to do with it. So I'm going to go ahead and print it. So system.out.println, and we'll say that we want to output just true or false. Okay. So let's go ahead and compile and run. Okay, and there's my output false, right? So we created a new pet object. That pet's name is Max, right? His age is 3, and we called the isAdopted method on that cat Max, and Max's instance variable default value for adopted is false. Now, what if Max gets adopted? I need a way to change the value of Max's adoption status. So now we're going to need another method to do that. So public, and this method isn't going to return anything. It's just going to change the value of the instance variable. So its return type will be void. So public void, and then we'll call this one change adopted, and we're going to pass in the Boolean for initial adopted status. You open brace, and this is going to take the adopted instance variable and reassign its value to the initial value that's been passed by parameter into this method. Okay, so let's go back to cat's main and call that method that we just created. So pet1 for Max, and we're going to change adopted. So let's say Max gets adopted. So we're going to change his status to true, and now when we print out Max's status, okay, let's go ahead and compile and run. Okay, so our first print statement was the default value for is adopted. The adopted was false. Then in line 7, we changed Max's adoption status to true. And when we printed it out, now is he adopted, it returned the current value, which is true. Okay, so we have looked at the return method. Right here we have a return type of a Boolean versus a non-return method, which its return type is void, so it doesn't return anything. We looked at this is adopted, which returns rather the value of an instance variable. That's a getter method, also called an accessor method in Java. And we looked at this type, which it does not return an instance variable. Instead, it receives data passed by parameter from the calling and replaces instance variable data with that value that was passed by parameter. And that is a mutator method or a setter method. Okay, there's another type of method which performs a task or a function. So for instance, if we wanted not to return anything but to print some information about an animal at our cat shelter, then I could have this method, instead of returning information, I can have it do that print. So I'm going to do a system out print function or print format, and that means I need a string literal. And let's have it print the name of the cat. So that's a % and then S for string. And we'll say the cat's name is, then we'll have % again. And let's use our instance variable for age. So age is an integer, so we use a D for the cat's age, then years old. And its adoption status is, and then we can put a % and then a B for Boolean, right? That's going to bring in the Boolean variable. Then we want to go to a new line, so we'll use escape sequence /n, and we can close our string literal. Then after the string literal, we need a comma, and we're going to put in the variables that match the S, the D, and the B. So S was for the string, and that's the name. The %D, that was for the age. And then the %B, that was the Boolean, which is adoption status, so adopted. Okay, and then a semicolon, and then we can close the brace on our print method. Okay, so now let's go ahead and test out this method. It's not an accessor method because we're not accessing and returning the value of an instance variable. It's not a mutator method because we're not changing any data associated with an instance variable. Right? This is a method that's going to perform a function or an action for us. It's void, so it's not returning any values. And it's going to perform this task of printing the information about the pet. So let's call that method pet1.print, and then we'll go ahead and compile and run. Oh, I think I have to pull this up a little higher. Okay, and there's our printed statement. Max is 3 years old and its adoption status is true. Okay, one more thing that I want to talk about before we wrap this lesson up is encapsulation. So encapsulation is when you make things private in a class and you prevent them being accessed directly by other classes. So for instance, these instance variables that we created, the name, the age, and the adoption status, they're all marked as private. Okay, if I were to change this from private to public, okay, it's still going to compile, right? So we're going to go ahead and let that change compile. And then when I come back over to main, because it's public, from this other class, I would be able to grab that data. I could access that value. So let's test that out. So system out print line pet1.name. Okay, so it's going to come over, oops, forgot the one. It's going to come over to the pet1 object in the cats class, and it's going to grab its name right from the instance variables without having to go through any methods. So let's go ahead and compile and run. And there's Max's name, right? It grabbed that name right from the other class. Now, we don't want access to data to be that easy. So we're gonna always make anything that we don't want other classes to access, we want that information to be locked down, so we make it private. And that forces the calling class, right, in this case the runner, to go through a method and know the name of that method in order to access that data. So if I, excuse me, make my name data private in cats.java, and then I try to access it here in the runner, right, pet1.name, which last time when it was public returned the cat's name. Now when I run, I get an error, okay? And let's arrow up here and look at that error. So it says exception, right, illegal access error, right? Cats main tried to access private field cats.name. It's private, so it can't be accessed from outside of its original class, which is cats.